I have been following the Strait of Hormuz for over 15 years, and I have never seen anything quite like what unfolded in those waters 72 hours ago. Something happened between an American destroyer and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy that no one predicted. Not the analysts at the Pentagon, not the intelligence services tracking Iranian fleet movements, and not even the IRGC commanders who ordered the operation. 40 Iranian fast attack craft moved on a single United States Navy warship in formation, and what happened next has rewritten the rules of confrontation in the Persian Gulf. The provocation was expected. The swarming tactics were expected. The propaganda footage Iranian state television prepared in advance was expected. But what happened in the final 90 seconds of that encounter, behind the smoke and behind the wake of 40 retreating speedboats, was never supposed to be possible. Because in those 90 seconds, the United States Navy demonstrated a capability that Tehran has spent 2 decades insisting could neutralize American naval power in the Gulf. And that demonstration did not just send 40 boats running, it permanently destroyed the central pillar of Iranian asymmetric naval doctrine. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit the subscribe button. Turn on notifications immediately. What unfolds in the coming days inside the Persian Gulf will change everything analysts thought they understood about the balance of power in the world's most important maritime choke point. In the next few minutes, this analysis will show exactly how a single Arleigh Burke-class destroyer dismantled the swarm doctrine that Iran has built its entire naval identity around since 2007. It will explain why this incident has triggered an emergency session inside IRGC Naval Command, why senior commanders are now reportedly being purged, and why the Strait of Hormuz has entered a phase of vulnerability that Tehran cannot recover from in any operationally relevant time frame. To understand why this moment is so historically significant, consider that for nearly 2 decades, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy has built its entire deterrent posture on one unbreakable promise to the Iranian regime: that the Persian Gulf, and specifically the Strait of Hormuz, was a graveyard for American capital ships. This promise was not rhetorical. It was operational doctrine, written into IRGC training manuals, rehearsed in dozens of exercises, and displayed publicly through choreographed demonstrations involving hundreds of small boats moving in coordinated patterns. The doctrine traces back to the 2002 Millennium Challenge wargame, when a retired Marine general commanding the simulated opposition force used swarming small boats and shore-based anti-ship missiles to sink 16 American warships in a single morning. That exercise, which the Pentagon controversially restarted with new rules, became required reading inside the IRGC. Iranian commanders studied it for years. They built their fleet around its conclusions. By 2007, under the direction of then IRGC Navy Chief Ali Fadavi, Iran had constructed the largest fleet of small, fast attack craft in the world, with over 1,500 vessels organized into swarm formations designed to overwhelm American destroyers and cruisers through sheer numerical saturation. The theory was mathematically elegant. An Arleigh Burke-class destroyer carries a finite number of Mark 38 chain guns, phalanx close-in weapon systems, and crew-served weapons. According to assessments published by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, even the most optimistic projections suggested that a coordinated attack by 30 or more small craft would saturate a single destroyer's defensive envelope, forcing the warship to either retreat or accept damage that would render it combat ineffective. Iranian commanders, in interviews with state-controlled outlets like Tasnim News and Fars, repeatedly boasted that they could close the Strait of Hormuz within hours and sink any American vessel that attempted to reopen it. This was the doctrine. This was the promise. This was the foundation of Iranian regional power projection for 18 consecutive years. Every sanction, every assassination, every diplomatic humiliation was absorbed by the regime because the strait remained their ultimate leverage. As long as Tehran could credibly threaten to close Hormuz, it possessed the one card that mattered: the ability to spike global oil prices, paralyze the world economy, and force Washington to the negotiating table. That doctrine died 72 hours ago in approximately 90 seconds of combat action. The first dimension of this confrontation that must be understood is the operational sequence itself, because what the IRGC attempted was not improvisation. It was the doctrine, executed exactly as written. Multiple sources cited by defense correspondents at Reuters and the Associated Press confirmed that the destroyer in question was operating in international waters approximately 14 nautical miles south of Bandar Abbas, conducting freedom of navigation operations as part of Combined Task Force 152. The vessel had been tracked by Iranian coastal radar for approximately 6 hours before the engagement began. The IRGC response followed textbook swarm doctrine. 40 Boghammer and Paycap-class fast attack craft launched from 3 separate coastal facilities, converging on the American destroyer from multiple bearings simultaneously. The formation was designed to force the destroyer's Combat Information Center to track too many targets across too many threat vectors. Some boats carried twin 12.7mm heavy machine guns. Others carried single-rail launchers for Kausar and Nasr anti-ship missiles. A third element, the smallest and fastest boats, carried explosive payloads consistent with suicide attack configurations, similar to those used against the USS Cole in October 2000. According to a senior defense official cited by Bloomberg, the closing speed of the swarm exceeded 45 knots, with the lead element reaching within 1,200 meters of the destroyer before the American response began. 1,200 meters is inside the engagement envelope of every weapon those boats carried. By every metric Iranian doctrine measured, the swarm had already won. The destroyer should have been retreating, requesting air support, or absorbing damage. Instead, the destroyer accelerated directly toward the lead element of the swarm. The second dimension that must be examined is what the United States Navy actually did in those 90 seconds, because this is where Iranian doctrine collided with a capability Tehran did not understand the Americans possessed. The destroyer's response was not the response Iranian commanders had wargamed against. It was something newer, faster, and infinitely more lethal. The vessel activated an integrated defensive suite that combined the Mark 38 Mod 4 stabilized chain gun system with networked targeting data from an MH-60R Seahawk helicopter operating overhead and a pair of MQ-8C Fire Scout unmanned rotorcraft that had been loitering at higher altitude throughout the prior 6 hours. This is the critical point that Iranian doctrine never accounted for. The destroyer was not fighting alone. It was the visible node of a distributed sensor and weapons network that extended 40 nautical miles in every direction. The Fire Scout drones had been tracking every Iranian boat from the moment they left harbor. Their positions, headings, and weapon loadouts were known. The targeting solutions were calculated before the swarm ever reached engagement range. According to analysts at the Center for a New American Security, this represents the operational maturation of what the Navy calls the distributed maritime operations concept, a doctrine the service has been developing quietly since 2018. When the destroyer's Mark 38 systems opened fire, they did not fire blindly into the swarm. They fired with surgical precision at predetermined targets in a calculated sequence designed to maximize psychological effect. The lead boat in each of the 3 converging columns was destroyed first, in rapid succession, within the opening 12 seconds. Every Iranian commander watching from the trailing boats saw the vessel directly ahead of them disintegrate. The doctrine specified that swarms continue pressing the attack regardless of losses. The doctrine assumed losses would be statistical and random. What the doctrine did not anticipate was that the destruction would be selective, leadership targeted, and overwhelming. The third dimension requires examining what happened psychologically in those final 70 seconds, because the swarm did not retreat in good order. The swarm collapsed. Multiple maritime intelligence sources cited by Janes confirmed that within 40 seconds of the first shots, the formation lost cohesion. Boats began turning independently, abandoning their assigned attack vectors, and accelerating back toward Iranian territorial waters. Some boats reportedly collided with each other in the chaos, At least 2 were observed dumping their weapons overboard to gain speed. The supposedly disciplined IRGC formation that had been rehearsed for 15 years dissolved into individual panicked retreats in less than the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. The destroyer did not pursue. It did not need to pursue. It maintained its course, held its position, and continued the freedom of navigation operation it had been conducting before the swarm appeared. The Fire Scout drones followed the retreating boats back to within sight of Iranian harbors, recording everything. That footage, which has not been publicly released, but which has been described by officials cited by the Wall Street Journal, shows IRGC sailors visibly abandoning weapon stations and crew positions, with some boats arriving back in Bandar Abbas with crews who had not waited to dock before jumping overboard. This is what doctrine collapse looks like in the 21st century. Not a battle, not even a skirmish in the traditional sense. A demonstration so overwhelming that the losing side abandons not just the engagement, but the entire conceptual framework that justified the engagement. The fourth dimension is the strategic earthquake now reverberating through Tehran, and this is where the implications become genuinely irreversible. According to credible reporting from Iran International and corroborated by independent analysts at the Washington Institute, an emergency session of the IRGC Supreme Council was convened within 18 hours of the incident. Senior naval commanders, including officers who had served under Fadavi for over a decade, have been removed from operational posts. State television, which had pre-positioned propaganda footage celebrating the planned humiliation of the American destroyer, has not broadcast any reference to the encounter. Persian language analysts monitoring Iranian state media note that the silence itself is unprecedented because the regime almost always claims victory regardless of actual outcomes. The silence indicates something more dangerous than defeat. It indicates that the regime understands its doctrine is broken and cannot afford to acknowledge how broken it is. Because the moment the Iranian population, and more importantly the Iranian military, understands that the swarm doctrine no longer works, the entire deterrent architecture of the Islamic Republic in the Persian Gulf collapses. And once that collapse becomes common knowledge, the strategic calculations of every regional actor change overnight. Saudi Arabia, which has been quietly preparing for this exact strategic moment, is already moving. Sources cited by the Financial Times indicate that Riyadh has accelerated negotiations with American defense contractors for accelerated delivery of additional THAAD batteries and naval defense systems. The United Arab Emirates has reportedly held emergency consultations with Combined Maritime Forces Command. Even Oman, which has historically maintained careful neutrality between Iran and the Gulf states, has reportedly approved expanded American maritime patrol operations from its facilities at Duqm. Each of these developments was held in reserve, awaiting confirmation that Iranian naval power could be neutralized at acceptable cost. That confirmation arrived 72 hours ago. The fifth dimension, and perhaps the most consequential, involves what happens next inside Iran itself. Because the IRGC Navy is not merely a military organization, it is the core power base of the regime's hardline faction, the institutional vehicle through which the supreme leader projects domestic authority. When the IRGC Navy is humiliated in a manner that cannot be denied internally, even if it is denied publicly, the political ground beneath the entire hardline establishment begins shifting. Reformist factions, which have been marginalized for years, gain leverage. Reformist newspapers, which have been censored repeatedly, begin testing the boundaries of what can be reported. Bazaar merchants, who carry enormous economic and political influence in Iranian society and who have watched the regime's foreign policy destroy their businesses for 2 decades, begin asking harder questions. According to analysis from the Atlantic Council's Iran program, the IRGC's domestic legitimacy has always rested on its claimed ability to defend Iran against American military power. Strip away that claim, and the institution faces an existential identity crisis that no propaganda campaign can repair. The Friday sermon delivered at Tehran University 2 days after the incident, according to translations published by independent monitoring services, included an unusually defensive passage about how true strength is measured not by individual engagements, but by spiritual resilience. This is the language of an institution that knows it has lost something it cannot get back. All of this brings the analysis to a convergence that demands immediate attention from anyone tracking Middle East security, energy markets, or American strategic positioning. The naval humiliation in the Persian Gulf is not occurring in isolation. It is converging with three other developments that together constitute the most dangerous situation the Islamic Republic has faced since the founding of the regime in 1979. The first development is the doctrinal collapse just analyzed, which removes Iran's primary asymmetric military leverage in the Persian Gulf. The second development is the accelerating economic crisis inside Iran, with the rial reaching historic lows against the dollar and inflation officially exceeding 40%, while unofficial estimates from sources cited by the Institute of International Finance suggest real inflation exceeds 60%. The third development is the ongoing internal pressure from the women-led civil resistance movement, which, despite years of brutal suppression, continues to produce regular protests and acts of defiance documented by human rights organizations and Iranian diaspora monitoring services. The fourth development is the structural isolation of Iran from China, which has quietly reduced its discounted oil purchases from Iran by significant margins as Beijing recalculates the strategic value of Tehran following the Hormuz humiliation. These are not separate issues. They feed into each other in calculated, compounding ways. The naval humiliation accelerates the economic crisis because it removes the deterrent that allowed Iran to threaten oil markets. The economic crisis intensifies the civil resistance because Iranians cannot afford basic goods. The civil resistance reduces the regime's bandwidth to manage international challenges. The international isolation deepens because partners like China see a weakening regime and adjust their bets accordingly. And at the center of this storm sits Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who at 86 years old has been almost completely invisible in public appearances for nearly 3 weeks. This is the reality of Iran in this current moment. Not one crisis, but 4 overlapping crises destroying the regime's strategic position from every direction simultaneously. According to credible reporting from multiple sources monitoring Iranian energy infrastructure, Tehran now has only a 10 to 15-day window before its onshore oil storage facilities reach maximum capacity. Once that capacity is reached, the regime faces an impossible choice: either shut down production wells, which causes permanent damage to reservoir pressure and reduces long-term extraction capacity, or accept fire sale pricing that further damages already collapsed revenues. Every single day this situation continues, Iran is not only losing current revenue, it is permanently destroying future capability. The countdown has begun, and it is measured in days, not weeks. Simultaneously, the IRGC Navy faces its own countdown. According to assessments from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the institution must demonstrate continued operational relevance within approximately 30 days or face internal restructuring that could fundamentally weaken its political position. But any provocation it attempts now faces the same distributed maritime operations capability that just dismantled the swarm doctrine. The institution is trapped between the necessity of action and the impossibility of successful action. This is precisely the strategic position that produces miscalculation and catastrophic decision-making. And this is what makes the next 2 weeks the most dangerous period in Persian Gulf security in over a decade. The convergence is undeniable. The doctrine is broken. The economic clock is ticking. The political ground is shifting. And the regime that has dominated regional calculations for over 4 decades is running out of options simultaneously across every dimension that has historically sustained its power. Anyone who tells you this situation will simply continue along familiar patterns is not paying attention to what just happened in those waters south of Bandar Abbas. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications immediately. This analysis will continue tracking every major development in this rapidly evolving crisis as it unfolds across the coming days and weeks. The next briefing will examine the specific Iranian response options now under discussion in Tehran And which of those options represents the highest probability for the next phase of escalation? That briefing could publish within hours of new developments, and without notifications enabled, viewers will miss the analysis when it matters most. Drop thoughts in the comments below. Does the IRGC Navy attempt another provocation within the next 30 days to recover lost credibility? Or does Tehran shift its escalation entirely to proxy forces in Iraq, Yemen, and Lebanon to avoid another direct humiliation? This is the binary choice now facing Iranian strategic planners, and the answer will determine whether the Persian Gulf remains the central flashpoint or whether the conflict migrates to less defensible terrain for American interests. Every comment is read, every perspective is considered, and the most insightful analyses from this community frequently shape the direction of future briefings. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay ahead, and the next brief will arrive when the next development demands it. Ask anything, create anything. Claude Opus 4.7. Claude Opus 4.7.